And the reason for that is that the citizens are the ones that provide the food, that provide morale, that are the hospitals. In total warfare, you target and kill, or just target and harm the citizens, because what you're trying to do is get the citizens to surrender. And once the citizens' morale falls, or you killed enough of them, the war comes to an end. Almost every war that we've seen fall apart, even when the forces were the forces that were mightier, for example, the American Revolution, the British were the #1 army and navy in the world. They had the most money in the world, but the citizens of Britain did not support the American Revolution. They didn't want the British fighting. And even though they had all these powers, eventually it was the morale and the lack of supplies that the citizens were willing to share that ended the war, with the French coming in as allies. So Serbs really attacked the citizens. It was very dangerous to go outside. We faced every day going down the street, you could be hit with a sniper. And they targeted people, not just in a sense of taking out maybe military people, but just ordinary citizens. There were cases where snipers would literally target a person, hit them specifically somewhere to make them not mobile, and then shoot at them for hours. And the reason for it, like women, children, grandmothers, just to kind of terrorize the people. But even with that, the Bosnian forces did not give up. Not to say that the Serbs were the only aggressors. My family was mixed. My mom's side of the family is Muslim. My dad's side of the family was Serbian. And because we had stature within the city with my mom's side of the family, we were able to have some benefits of being able to maybe get some supplies. But my father, my mother, and I carried a Serbian last name. So we were targeted. I remember going to school because schools were established. They wanted us to continue learning the importance of education, even through chaos, which is what you're experiencing right now. They would give out, for example, goodies like goodie bags, but they would give it only out to Muslim children, the children that had Muslim last names, and would not give it out to children who were Serbian. So there was targeting and profiling on all ends. My father did not leave our apartment or my grandparents' apartment for 2 years, because what they would often do is that they would, you had to have papers to say why you were able to walk around. And when you were out, any military person could stop you and ask you to show them your papers. And if you were male, if you weren't volunteering or fighting in the army, you had to have a job. And my father was not able to stay in a job. He was the principal of a high school. He lost his job right away because of his background. So he stayed hidden, because often they would take the Serbs and put them in front lines, almost as shields, to make sure that the other Muslim soldiers were able to basically get more coverage. So we stayed in the war for about 2.5 years. Again, no electricity, no running water, shelling on and off all day. But as children, we were somewhat shielded. We were obviously fully aware of what this meant. We could hear snipers, we were bombed on, we have a lot of trauma, but we would perform and get together when we could with our friends, and we went to school. So the hard thing about war is that you kind of have this normalcy continue, just for sheer purpose of survival. You guys are probably doing that right now. You're sheltering in your homes, but you're trying to remain some normalcy by going to school, talking to your friends, even though it might not be in person. You're trying to remain normalcy to basically continue your mental state, with the hopes of this will eventually end. And we want to make sure that we have progressed, that we've learned, that we have socially, distanced ourselves, but still talk to people and kept some of these relationships. Now, there was a deciding moment in February of 1992. The Serbs threw two high advanced bombs on a city market. It was an open market for food, and they killed over 80 people. And not only did they kill them, but the bombs were basically made to have so much shrapnel that they almost incinerated and destroyed people. And there were always cameras around, because obviously war and journalism. And it just happened that the cameras were in City Hall, which was right next door to the market. And the images kind of not only flooded the Bosnia's newspapers and whatever TVs were working, but the world's. So it was at that time the United States and the world started to intervene, and they asked Serbia to cease fire. Basically, they put restrictions on Serbia's trade, which you also know through history is something a country will do to try to basically minimize the aggression on the other end without actually going to war. And it was during this time that my family decided that we had to leave the city. It had become much more dangerous for my father to be there, and we had been targeted few times because of our last name. So with the help of some friends that my parents had, my mom actually had a physical disability. She had had a dislocated hip her whole life and had actually been qualifying to have surgery before the war started. So based on her medical need, my mom and I were able to leave the city in convoys. And we went to a neighboring city called Zenica, which was about an hour out. And then we went to Croatia. My father used plagiarized and falsified papers, saying basically in those papers said that my mother and I had been out for 2.5 years, which was false. And that he was basically looking to unite with us in Croatia, in Zagreb, which is the capital of Croatia. So he was able to get out about 2 months after us. Now, the reason why we went specifically to Zagreb is because we were seeking refugee status. My mom's cousin, her only cousin, had married an American years before the war started. It was in the late 1980s. And Dennis and my aunt, Narcissa, and their 3 children had lived in Belgrade, Serbia, for about 5-6 years. Dennis had actually lived in Yugoslavia for 10 years.
Jasenka, sorry, can I ask you a quick question? A student is wondering how much time had passed since the beginning of the siege at this point.
When we left, it was about 2.5 years. And the siege of Sarajevo then continued for another year. There was only one way in and out of the city, which was they had dug a tunnel under the airport. The airport in itself was at the end of the city, which often airports are. And the only way the supplies would come in and out of Sarajevo is that people would literally go into this tunnel, but it was dangerous because they would bomb the beginning of the tunnel and they would bomb the end of the tunnel. So people would do it in the middle of the dark. And then after that, you would have to basically almost run uphill for about, I want to say 10 kilometers and then get to buses that could take you. So it was very limited to who could actually physically sustain this. So it was mostly soldiers that would go in and out, supplies would come in, and that was it. But we went to Zagreb, and we stayed with a random person. We didn't have family out there. My mom had made friends with a Croatian woman during the war, and she said, listen, my mom lives in Zagreb. If you're ever there, just stop by and see if she can help you out. And we literally, with one suitcase, went to her doorstep and just asked her to take us in, and she did. She, without knowing us, she took me, my mom, and my dad in for about 3 months. We went straight to the embassy.
Why didn't you stay with your cousin? Is another question we're getting. Are we
getting? Yeah, the cousin that lived. Oh no, so my aunt. I call her my aunt, even though she's my mom's cousin. They lived in Belgrade, Serbia. When the war in Bosnia started, all the Americans got evacuated. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but the American embassy actually does a pretty good job of evacuating American citizens straight out of any country during a war or an epidemic. Currently,
they've been doing that. I don't know if you guys saw, they're sending constant emails now for getting people out of Colombia.
And they are. They're doing the same thing in Bosnia right now. They're getting all the Americans out. So the American embassy will literally come to your door, which they did to my aunt and uncle. They knocked. Bosnia's war started in Sarajevo on April 6th. On April 7th, soldiers showed up to my aunt and uncle's apartment in Serbia. And they said, you have 24 hours to pack everything you have, sell, do whatever, and you're leaving. It wasn't even an option. They were evacuating all American citizens. And when they got evacuated, they just went back to where Dennis was from, which was a city in Massachusetts. So my aunt, uncle, their children, and my grandmother's sister my great grandmother had all come to United States from Belgrade and had been living here. They send us a letter. So as a refugee, you can come to any country through two ways. One, you just go and you try to seek asylum, or you get this thing called like a guarantee letter. And the guarantee letter basically says that someone is guaranteeing that they will take care of you once you are within that country. Because Dennis is a established high class CEO of a company, a shoe company, they had a lot of money. So they wrote a letter saying that basically once my mom, my father, and I had left Bosnia and had approached and tried to seek asylum and through refugee status and come to United States, that they would take care of us. That sped the process up a lot, because even as a refugee, your chances of coming to a country are much higher than an immigrant, because refugees usually get status due to persecution. United States at that time, the United States has a quota. They only allow, let's say, less than 3% of a people from a particular country to come to United States per year. But when there are wars, often a country will open its borders up. And instead of saying maybe 3%, they'll say 15% of people can come. So there was a door open to come to United States. But for us, the process got sped up for basically two reasons. One, we had someone who said they were going to take care of us financially, which is wonderful because the country then wouldn't have to shell out money for us to come here. And the second thing that really made us desirable is that my parents were highly educated. They had come from a mixed marriage, which means they couldn't really go back. And they had one child who was female. That's another thing I don't think a lot of people know, but often a country will desire people who have female children more than male, because I don't know if it's like way in the back reproduction thing, but we were highly desired refugees. And we were in Zagreb for about 3 months. We went through multiple interviews where they asked us what experience we had during the war, why we wanted to come to United States, and so forth. I actually did horrible during all of those interviews because I didn't want to leave. I had friends in Sarajevo. I was 12 and a half. I had a crush on a boy. I actually, in the middle of an interview, told the interviewing committee that I didn't want to leave and I wanted to go back to Bosnia. And my parents were mortified, but obviously no one listens to a 12-year-old. And we were able to come. Now, the one thing that I think you will find interesting is that often refugees go through an Americanization process. And what that means is that you go to an Americanizing school. So for a week, we would go and they would tell us what it would be like for us to come to United States.
Sorry, Jasenka, did you guys speak English at this point? Is a question I'm getting.
No, okay. I did not speak any English. My dad, I would say maybe slightly. My mom didn't speak any English and I didn't either. But again, we were highly desired because we had someone who was going to shell out money for us, and my parents were highly educated. So we went to this Americanization school where for about a week, they tell you what it's going to be like to come to a foreign country, and what America is like. And I don't remember most of it, obviously, because I was young. I do remember one thing. All of us had to be tested to see if we had HIV, AIDS, because you were not allowed to come to United States at that time if you had HIV or AIDS. We tested negative. And then we went through this process of every day kind of having a different focus of them telling us what it was going to be like to come to United States. Some things were kind of offensive. There was one point where they were teaching us how to use the toilet, like how to flush. And I think the assumption was that there are people, obviously, in the world.
At this point, you're thinking 92?
This was 94.
Okay.
This was summer of 94. So some things were highly offensive. They showed us like how electricity works, and simple things. And then they told us a little bit about American culture. Now, I myself, for years before the war, had become obsessed with, I don't know if you know of the show, but Beverly Hills 90210. So in my mind, that was America, right? Just cool cars, rich kids. And I was kind of ready for it. I was like, okay, that's going to be nice. But I remember specifically them telling the Bosnian parents that in America, children were not respectful and that they got away with much more. And then they did a whole class about how you couldn't hit your children, because in Bosnia it is very traditional even nowadays to spank or hit your child. You know, if you're not listening to your parents, they might slap you across the face. Doesn't matter if you're in a market. In United States, you can't really do that. So they did. That's the one thing I remember. We did almost like a whole day where they had to talk to parents about laws of you can't beat your children, you can't beat your wives. And my family didn't believe in that, nor had I ever experienced any form of abuse. But I do remember in class, there were a few people, especially men, who were like, what am I supposed to do with them then? Like, how will they listen to me? And my parents were like kind of mortified as well. But that's the other thing I want to mention. Often when people think of refugees, they think of like a cluster of people that are very similar just because they're coming from the same country. So it'd be same thing if I said, well, you guys live in Colombia. I have met a person in Mexico. It's all, you know, Americas, so it's the same thing. You know that even within your own city, people are different based on their educational opportunities, the money that they have, how they live. But often refugees are kind of put into one group. They're just refugees. And often in refugees, you can have a scientist who has a PhD, and you could also have a person who has never used an indoor toilet. And that's one thing to just keep in mind, because obviously we're seeing a lot of refugee talk regarding Syria. And often people kind of lose this idea. We see camps of Syrians just kind of living in the desert, but in that you could have a professor.
Oh, sorry, one more question, Jasenka. Is this Americanization classes, were they being taught in Serbia or when you were in?
They were taught in Croatia. We never went to Serbia. We went from Bosnia to Croatia, and they were taught in Zagreb, which is the capital of Croatia, where we were for 3 months before we came to the United States. But this is a common process that as a refugee, that you kind of go through this, like what to expect when to come to United States. Then we were approved, and within 3 months left. That's also highly unusual for a refugee to basically come from a war-torn country and get status and placement in 3 months. But again, we had someone vouching for us, and 2, my parents were highly educated and desired. So we left Croatia in August of 1994. And we flew to Boston, Massachusetts, which is where I still live now. My aunt came to pick us up. I just remember I had never been on a plane for that long. I had flown, but it was mostly like an hour or 2 around Europe. This was an over the ocean 7-hour or 8-hour ride. I remember back in the day, you could smoke in an airplane. They had a smoking and a non-smoking section, and my parents smoked because everyone in Europe smoked. So we sat in the back where they literally, like, it's very interesting because can you smoke in Colombia in places?
Can you?
Like cigarettes.
Yeah,
Public.
you
No,
smoke
but not like at restaurants, can you?
Designated spots.
Depends.
Outside, you can outside.
Okay, so in United States now, you can't smoke anywhere inside, but for a long time you could. So basically we sat in the back of the plane where everyone was smoking like one cigarette after another because they were all very kind of anxious. And I just remember that sticking with me. And then we landed, and it was the night. And I just remember, like, you come to United States, you expect to see like either a view or something great. And I didn't see anything because it was the middle of the night. And we just drove to Franklin. Franklin is an hour outside of Boston. It is a very small, all-American city. If you ever think of United States, like what you would consider like a typical American house, it's a mom and a dad, maybe 2 to 3 kids. It's a house with a white picket fence. There's a dog, American flags everywhere. It is pretty much so where we moved. So I just remember waking up and the house was huge. There was so much like land, and it's really hard to go within 3 months from somewhere where you didn't have electricity, were starving, were bombed, to like basically completely different world. And I just remember thinking about like how quickly someone's reality can change, how you can go from a war-torn country where you think you're going to die every day to like the American dream, if you want to say. There we found an apartment. We didn't have any money. We had lost pretty much so everything. We had $1,000. When we moved, my uncle lended us some money. Franklin, which many American cities don't have public transportation. So you either have to walk or you drive. And the reason why a lot of American cities don't have trains or buses is because everyone is middle class, which means that they can afford to have a car. And we didn't have anything. So we spent $1,000 that we had on a car because my dad wanted to get a job. And we lived in a small little apartment. We got all of our furniture through either donations or, you know, very cheap like secondhand stores. And because we came here in August, it was time for me to enroll in school. I was going to be in 7th grade. In United States, you have a thing called middle school, which is grade 1 through 5. Then they have middle school, which is so elementary school 1 through 5, middle school is 6 through 8, and then high school is 9 through 12. So I was going to be in middle school in 7th grade. And I remember going with my aunt. This was about 2 or 3 weeks after we had come, and she had brought my report cards. And she came in and she was speaking to them, and they were like, wow, she has really good grades. By the time I left Bosnia, we had 14 subjects, including like physics and chemistry. So I was knowledgeable. And then I remember my aunt saying to them, she doesn't speak English. And they were just like, what? They were like, she doesn't speak English. The school I was coming into, which was about, I would say 500 to 700 students, I was the only child who was foreign. Once we actually went through this, I found out that there had never been anyone in Franklin Public Schools who had not spoken English. I was the only and the first person. So it was a cultural shock, in a sense, to go to a school with everybody speaking a language you don't. I blended, meaning I'm white and everyone was white. I look similar to what a lot of people looked like because Americans who are white are European descent. So physically, I blended in. I didn't really stand out. Maybe some of my clothes because I dressed differently culturally because I was European. But then my name was different and I didn't speak English. And I remember coming in on the first day of school and just kind of sitting down. I had my dictionary with me and there was a form we had to fill out. And on the form, it said, are you female or are you male? And I had no idea what female or male was. And I had to like go through my dictionary to find everything. Now, they had no solution for me. As I mentioned, I'm a teacher. I have many students who are Guatemalan, who are Dominican, Puerto Rican. When students come from Central South America, which is most of our second speaking, or Africa, students, they go into emergent classes, meaning that their classes are taught with other students who are learning to speak English. We have 3 levels of English learner speakers until you are merged into regular speakers. So level 1 basically means you've come to the country, you don't speak any language, and you'll get math, English, science, and history with other kids who don't speak English. And half of the time will be dedicated to learning English, the other one to content. There were no such classes in Franklin because I was the only foreign child. So I was just thrown into all American classes. And I would say this was good in one sense. It forced me to learn English relatively quickly. It also forced me to not have an accent, which is really rare for someone who comes here at 13 to not have a heavy accent, like a Russian accent. So a lot of people that you might hear speaking Bosnian, they speak it like this because they have a heavy accent, like your typical Russian, you would say, like Slavic language accent. But because my ear was constantly every day listening to English that was spoken by English only speakers, I was able to pick up accents faster and I was able to learn English. It was still hard because one, I missed home. Culturally speaking, there were some shocks. I mean, obviously, we had electricity and we'd come from a well-established country prior to this. But my life had been in a capital city where I had friends. I was able to kind of roam by myself. Even at age 10, you know, my parents would give me some lunch money and I would get on a train and go and meet up with my friends or go to a park. And in a typical suburban town, you have to be driven everywhere by your parents. So there isn't any freedom. And this is very culturally speaking typical for American children. But it was not for me. So I would say throughout all of my high school time, I lived this double life, a life where I had blended in physically because I'm white and I'd learned English well enough, and I'd made friends, but I also constantly kind of like longed to go back to Bosnia. And I did. In 1997, my mom and I, for the first time, were able to go back. The war had ended the year and a half prior, and we went to visit. And I went to visit throughout the first, I would say, 7 to 8 years. I would go every summer and every winter because part of me always felt like that was home. And that's another thing about refugees or even immigrants, is that you kind of become this like dual person, that you have a life where you are at home in one place, but you're constantly yearning for something else. This is something many of you will experience. Once this passes and you go to college, you will leave your parents' home, hopefully. And with time, you will be living this life where maybe like you yawn, like, or yearn for where your childhood life was, and that could maybe remain who you are as an adult, but you could dramatically change your views once you're away from your environment. It's, you know, when you are in a different environment, when you go to college or you travel, you go abroad, when you meet people that are different from you, that will challenge the way you think, the way you're raised, what your cultures and customs are. And it's sometimes for the first time in your life, you might be challenged in that way. And for some people, they will kind of remain in their identity throughout their whole life. And some people will kind of, emerge into something new. And I think what often happens with people who live abroad, immigrants, refugees, or just people who move, you have this constant double culture, especially if you move to a country that's different from you. So instead of, let's say, stay in Colombia your whole life, you move to Japan and you live your adult life there. You kind of will have this dual life where you emerge into a culture that is very different than yours, a language that's very different than yours, and you might even like some of those customs, but then you might yearn for the language and the customs of home. And I think that's still true for me, especially to today, where I feel like even in my, I'm in my late 30s now, and I've lived in United States much longer than I've ever lived in Bosnia. I've lived in the US for 20 something years, and I've only lived in Bosnia for 12 years. I always feel like I'm in two places. Like I am American, but I'm also Bosnian. But I'm not completely American, but I'm also not completely Bosnian. And I think for a lot of refugees, the hard thing is that we didn't choose to leave. Immigrants choose to leave. They go because they're looking for a better life. My parents would have never left where we were because our lives were so good. Imagine where you guys are living now. It seems that a lot of you have very nice homes and very comfortable lives. And imagine a disaster where tomorrow you had to flee the city, not only the city, but the country, and you had to go somewhere. That meant that all of you who are now friends would not see each other ever again. And so it's that idea where you're an immigrant, you make a decision to leave. You often say goodbye to people. You might be able to go back, but when you're a refugee, it's almost like, if you watch a movie and there's like a war or zombie apocalypse and everyone's just kind of running out and you're not packing anything. It's that mind, like set where it's just chaos and you're not really leaving in good circumstances and there's nothing for you to go back to. Maybe your home is destroyed. So for refugees, what you always want to keep in mind is that it's not a choice. Often it's through prosecution. You have left because people where you were trying to kill you, or were trying to basically like kill off your people. As you had, if you had a chance, studied Bosnia and the war, there were a lot of genocide, up to like 15 to 20,000 people killed at a time. So it wasn't just a war where soldiers shoot soldiers. There was genocide. And it's really hard for people as refugees to kind of feel like, where do they belong? The home that they have left is not the home that they had before, but they're also not truly at home where they are now, because linguistically, culturally, maybe religiously, they are still different. Once you often move to a new country, they try to keep refugees together based on their culture. So it is not uncommon. So let's say there was a huge disaster in Colombia and all of you had to leave, they would try to cluster you together. So if you were going to move to, let's say, Boston, you might live or try to live in a specific place in Boston. Sometimes they do it because that's the least desirable place to live. And sometimes they do it because they know that for a person or for a group of people to be able to transition or deal with traumas of where they have come from, it's nice to be around familiar things. And that can be cultures and languages and cuisines. So in the United States, it's not uncommon to go through a city and see different pockets of cultures. We have Chinatown, where a lot of people who had been Chinese descent have formed towns, Little Italies, where a lot of Italian immigrants lived. A lot of parts of Dorchester or Boston, they have little pockets of, let's say, Dominican culture or Puerto Rican culture or Guatemalan culture. We don't have tons of Colombian culture in Boston, but I know New York or some of the southern parts of United States do. So that's pretty much so it. For me, I could talk about this for hours. I'm a teacher, so we can talk, as you can imagine. But I wanted to see if you guys had any specific questions for me.
Yeah, I know at least. Okay, so let's do Tobon, Alejandro Yepes, Salo, and then if you guys want to go in the list, just message me through the chat like me, and then I'll call on you next. So let's start with Tobon.
So I have a question, and it's basically asking, like, what do you think for you was the hardest part of Americanization, and was there any legal problem you encountered, or did it all go smoothly?
I'll speak about the second first. No, we had no problems. We have come to United States again legally. The process in itself is much easier that way. When we came, refugees were offered a green card after a year. And then within 5 years, you were able to apply for your citizenship, which we did. The one interesting thing is that when you become a citizen of any country, you had to go through a test. So you have all these questions, you go in front of like an officer, not a police officer, but someone who works for the government. And they ask you questions. You know, who was the first president of the United States? How many states are there? And then they ask you to write a sentence. And because at the time I had turned 18, I didn't qualify to become a citizen through my parents. So I had to take the test myself. And I remember going in, my dad went to one room, I went to another room, and I went to a third room by myself. And I was 18. And the officer who was working there was, I would say, maybe 21 or 22. And we were very close in age. And I just remember going in, And he was just kind of like holding his head. He was going like this. And I was like, oh, did you have a long night? And he was like, oh yeah, I went out with my friends. And so he started telling me about his night. And I sat down and we talked for about 15 minutes about like just our life. And then he was like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to ask you a question. And he was like, how many states are there? And I was like, 50. And he's like, right, I have a cat. I wrote, I have a cat. He's like, awesome, welcome to the country. And he then gave me his card, which had his number. And he was like, why don't you call me? And so I was like, okay. And I left and I came out and my parents were like sweating. And I was like, how was your test? And they're like, oh my God, they asked me 20 questions. They asked me everything. And they were like, how was your test? And I was like, mine was fine. I passed. I didn't tell them that the guy had just hit on me and wanted to have drinks later. But we had no problems, especially because, again, I had grown up here. They don't really give hard problems to refugees who are Americanized. It certainly helps to be white because we blend in and there's still so much white privilege that exists in American society. Now, in terms of your first question, again, it was easy to kind of assimilate in a culture where you look the same. All of the people in Franklin were white. But there were certain cultural differences. For example, just language. It's really hard to translate little quirks that a language has produced based on the culture you have. I also had come with a lot of trauma that I was not aware of. A lot of people, even when I came, do not talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Often you get it through war. You can get it through a car accident, or you can get it through a very scary experience in your life, but there's not a lot of talk about it. So I remember clearly having a hard time learning English, coming into this world that was so vastly different from where I had come from, yet everyone kind of looked like me. It would be the same thing if you guys went and moved to an all-American city. Most of you would blend physically. You're very light-skinned. You look like you have European heritage, but you still would speak a different language, or you have an accent. And even if you dressed and looked the part, the moment you opened your mouth, you were different. So I feel like it's really hard to kind of find my place. And it's still something I struggled with, where I physically often blend in, but culturally speaking, it's hard. And no one could really understand what I had gone through, because for them, it was like, oh, I didn't get a BMW for my birthday. I only got like a Mercedes, and I really wanted that BMW. It was just such different worlds, where I had gone from having a very nice life to basically living in a war. So I would say culturally that's been the hardest thing. I didn't feel like I blended much in, or even culturally fit in Franklin, which is why when I turned 18 and I finished high school, I moved to Boston. And I myself now, I don't know if your teacher has mentioned anything, but I work in an inner city high school. So where I work, I have maybe 2 white students. All of my students are either African American or Hispanic. And I have found myself much more connected to that population than I've often to white Americans. And the reason for that, I think, is that even though we might racially not fit in, I understand what it's like to struggle to be different. Obviously, my difference is easier to mask because I'm white, so I physically blend in. But I understand what it means like to move somewhere where people don't speak your language. Many of my students are second language speakers. Or to come with trauma. I have students who have come with a lot of trauma. Even if they themselves have not had trauma. I've actually had a student who was Colombian, and his father had taken part in the fighting, in the civil fighting that had been taking place in Colombia. And even though he himself moved from Colombia to Boston when he was 1, his father had had so much trauma that the student itself had a lot of trauma kind of trickled in down generationally. So I culturally have found myself sometimes connecting more to students who physically look different than me than those that physically look like me, based mostly on culture.
Okay,
I
thank
hope
you.
that answered it.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Yepes, sorry, I have like a list going here. So Alejandro.
Hi. So my question is, after the war was over, why didn't you go back to Bosnia?
It wasn't safe. One, even now, the country has really never gone back on its feet. What they decided to do after the war is that they took the three people, the Serbs, the Bosnians, and the Croats, and they divided Bosnia up into three pieces. And they set up a really bad government. So Bosnia never really got back on its feet economically. And I wanted to go back. Through my high school, as I was growing up, I told my parents, as soon as I graduate high school, I'm leaving, I'm going to Bosnia. And my parents were always like, no, go to school, go to college in the United States. And I was dead set on moving to Bosnia once I graduated high school. But to be honest, I met a boy. I fell in love when I was a senior in high school, and I decided to stay mostly because of him. And he's now my husband, so that kind of worked out. But I stayed for him, but I always went back. So I would go for 2 or 3 months at a time to Bosnia during summers or when I had break. But with time, I also realized that I didn't blend in. Once you live somewhere for so long, I've lived here for 22 years. I'm not 100% American, but I'm not 100% Bosnian either. As I mentioned, you will realize this when you leave your homes. And when you often leave your home, you become your own person with time. And sometimes you'll go back to what should be very familiar, and you feel like you don't quite fit in. Some of you might not feel like you fit in now. You might have many different views than your parents or your grandparents. So you might actually understand that currently, what it feels like to be part of a unit or part of a thing where you don't feel like you are fitting perfectly into it. So I never really could fit back into Bosnia. Some of the mentality, I'd become American. My mindset had changed, as yours will if you move out of your house or your neighborhood, even if you leave Colombia. You kind of become a different person. So I never moved back because, one, again, it was just never same. It was not as safe, and the economy wasn't as great. And then again, it never really felt like home anymore. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Jasenka. Salo.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I have 2 questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
The first one is, did you ever reconnect with your childhood friends from Bosnia? And
Let me answer that one because I'm old, I'll forget. So some of the friends I had when I was really little, I was able to connect through Facebook and Instagram. When it came out, people started to find each other. So I found some of the people I went to school with before the war when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade. And some of it was happy endings and some wasn't. I had a friend, my best friend. His name was Marco. And we went to school together, and we, in the beginning of the war, we were together all the time. I was actually with him the first time that the first bomb hit in Sarajevo. And then when we left the apartment, I never saw him again. And I had looked for him literally like my whole life. I had hoped to reconnect with him. And it was through Facebook when I found some of my old classmates. One of them ended up living in the same town. He had left Sarajevo, went to Croatia, and she told me that he had died. He had become a drug addict in his teens and had OD'd when he was in his early 30s. And that was a really, really hard thing because I felt like I never got to say goodbye to him. Some of the friends I made during the war are still my best friends. I literally spoke to them yesterday. Every time I would go back to Bosnia, it was them that I would either stay with or be with. So yes, I still have friends in Bosnia that I've had since I was your age or younger. Social media has certainly helped to keep everyone in contact.
Okay. And my second question is, the United States is obviously famous for like ethnically profiling refugees, immigrants after like 9/11 or even now Trump. Do
Yeah.
you think that you were ever like put under the loop and just like, or just put under like, so
Yeah.
like socially?
No, I mean, the hard thing is that, again, as I said, I blend in physically.
Hmm.
So the people that are profiled are people that are different. They either are different skin color, they are coming from a different country, but it really helped to come as a refugee from a European country. I don't know if you know this, not just you, but any of you, but Trump's wife, Melania, comes from the same country that I do.
Yeah.
She's from Slovenia. So literally, like, there's that connection that refugees or immigrants that come from Europe are treated better automatically because all the white people in America are European descent, as they are in Central and South America. They come from Spain, Portugal, Germany, Austria, Russia. So physically, I would blend. But I would say that sometimes the biggest thing was that people didn't get it. I don't think people got like that I didn't want to do certain things that they were really excited about. Like American football, woo, everyone loved it. And I was like, soccer? And they were like, what? No, soccer sucks. I was like, what? So I didn't really feel like I was profiled, but the only time I would say I could even pinpoint discrimination is because, when people talk about refugees and how awful refugees are, or how they milk the system and everyone has to pay for them, or people will talk to me about immigrants being bad without realizing that I'm a refugee. So they'll be like, oh, immigrants suck. They don't speak English. And I'm like, wait, what? But because I don't have an accent, people don't realize that I'm not a born American. Or my name. If I'm applying to something and someone has to call me, my name is Jasenka Arsic, or they're going to call Jane Smith, it is much easier to say Jane Smith. I've had many times people ask me if I had a nickname. They were like, can we call you Jessica or Jenny? And I'm like, no, learn my name. And when I was growing up, it was really hard. I went to a school where everyone had an Anglo-Saxon or Germanic name. So Steve's, John's. My students don't. My students now, it's very it's almost strange for me now to have a Jen or a Steve, because most of my students are Juans and Juajes, or are very African American or African names. So in that sense, I would say that the discrimination physically has not happened, but certainly you can still feel it a little bit culturally.
Thank you, Senga. So it's 2:30 for anyone who wants to go. If you have just a few more minutes, if you wouldn't mind, I do have a few more questions.
Yeah, that's fine.
It will be Greggy, Christina, Santi, and Camila. If you guys want to say, again, you guys are welcome to go. I only scheduled you till 2:30, but if you want to keep listening to Jasenka answer the questions, we would love to have you stick around as well. So who did I say? Greggy.
Okay, hi, I have a question, and is what would you think would be different if you were to move from Bosnia to the US in the 21st century?
One thing that would definitely be different is that it would be easier to stay in touch. I remember like moving to United States, and I would get a letter from a friend back home, and I'd be like, oh my God, I got a letter. And then I would write a letter back, and it would take 2 or 3 months. And then they would write back. So it's just the idea that, like, yesterday I was on live. We were doing like, I don't know if we were on Instagram talking to each other, and I could see my friends and they were telling me about their day, and I was talking about my day. And it's just that convenience would have certainly helped to be able to see people and stay in touch with them. And, I moved when Bill Clinton was president. And after Bill Clinton, it was Bush, and then it was Obama. So if I'd moved to United States now under Trump, I think that certainly would have had a big impact, because that Trump is not in favor of immigrants, even though, again, 2 of his 3 wives are immigrants. And all of his children, except one, are children of immigrants. But again, it's that whiteness, that white privilege that so many people are not aware of in United States that exists. So I think that would be also different.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Chrissy, if you're still here.
Hi. So last year I went to Croatia, and like we went to Dubrovnik, and I think like it's a similar situation because of like the placement they have in some way. But my question is more targeting like when we went to Croatia, they told us like they had incentives to get people back like after many refugees left. So for instance, like their housing, like they would give them the option if they had papers, they could even get a house built like next to the one that was bombed or things like that. So like did Bosnia has like a similar situation or?
No, the reason why Croatia is trying to get people back is because many people are leaving Croatia. Croatia became part of the European Union, as you are probably aware of. And because they had become part of European Union, many young Croats are leaving because they're going to, before England. So before they went to London, they went to Austria, they went to Germany. So Croatia was trying to bring people back, not so much refugees, but the young people that have left Croatia to go to other European countries. Bosnia is not part of the European Union and never will be. And the economy in Bosnia is still incredibly bad. They cannot, Croatia has the coast.
Why do you think it never will be, Jasenka?
They don't have the country's still split into three. So there's still a Serbian, a Bosnian, and a Croatian part, and they don't get along because, again, they had gone to war against each other throughout, not only the Bosnian war, but the wars before. So there's always that difference of like, we're different because our religions are different, and we have different customers. So it never functioned as one. Two, Croatia thrives on tourism. I mean, it's now the hot spot. If you talk to any celebrity, anyone is going to Croatia. That's the place to be. You need to go to Dubrovnik. You need to go party, in Zac or other places. And Croatia thrives on that. I'm very interested to see what will now happen with the economy. And with so many people not being able to fly or go places, because Croatia, again, a lot of their economy is based on the coast, and a lot of their commerce or even property has been getting bought out by European investors. That's the same thing in New York. I don't know if you're aware, but New York City, the city in itself, most of the real estate is not owned by America. Any guesses who's owned by?
The
It's
Chinese? The Chinese?
Exactly. So China owns more property in New York than Americans own. So in Croatia, a lot of the properties bought out or was bought out by the British. It's beautiful. It's untouched and much cheaper than a lot of other vacation spots. So if Bosnia never offered any program, it certainly won't offer it after this whole thing with COVID-19. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with Croatia as their tourism kind of goes away for at least the time that no one's traveling. But great question.
Cami? These are all great questions, guys. Cami, you're up. Where are you?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for telling us your story. I think it is not only interesting, but I also think it is very eye-opening. And my question is that, taking into account your difficult assimilation into an American education, specifically the language itself, as a teacher, what do you think governments and education systems should do in order to make this transition smooth for refugees?
Well, I mean, certainly, the hard thing is that we often think of United States as the country of immigrants and refugees, right? Everyone wants to come to United States. It is, the beacon of hope. But most of United States is not that open to immigrants or refugees, especially those ones that are not white. And I tell my students, because I teach history and we talk a lot about immigration throughout centuries, but you can relate to this yourselves. Think about like when you're in school and a new person comes. You don't know them, maybe to your class, and everyone kind of looks where they're going to blend in. How smart are they? How much money do they have? Do they play sports? And often we do this because it is a primal instinct. We're always comparing ourselves to other people because of our chances of survival. You know, we often talk about equality in every culture. Everyone's supposed to be equal. But if we were all in a jungle and there was going to be a lion chasing us, we do not want to be equals. You want to run faster than me, because if you run faster, I'm going to be the one getting eaten. So in every culture and every society, as much as we want to be equal, equality lessens everyone's chance of survival. And even without thinking it, a lot of policies of outsiders coming in are frowned upon. And even when people don't realize why they might not want people to come in, or why they don't maybe want to assimilate or bring people in, culturally speaking, every country kind of looks at how do we, meaning the people that are here, continue surviving. So I think any country that takes on refugees or immigrants does have a responsibility to then take care of them. As you know, a particular example of asylum seekers is the Central South Americans who have been trying to get into the United States illegally or legally, because again, to seek an asylum, you can do legally. But American government under Trump's orders have looked at asylum seekers as illegals trying to cross the border. And they're saying there's no difference. Now, the question is, would the same be true if these people were European? And that's hard because we have examples of that. During World War II, there were large ships of Jewish Europeans trying to seek asylum in the United States. Thousands of people came to New York or Washington and had asked the government at the time under FDR, President Roosevelt, to take them in because they actually were afraid of prosecution. And American government turned them away. We said no. Even though they were European, we said we had just come out of 1930s, which you know was the Great Depression, was the worst economic state, and we didn't feel like we had anything to give. So you could say, well, that's fair. If you couldn't help the citizens living in your own country, then you shouldn't take any more people in. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that many people in the United States right now don't have a lot. Most of my students live on government assistance. I work in a school where 95% of students live in extreme poverty. That means that they live in shelters, they're homeless, they live in housing projects, and their families make less than $15,000 a year for the whole family. So in United States, there's still extreme poverty that happens. We often don't realize that because in movies or through experiences, we don't see that. So it's hard because even when you take on new people, but you are neglecting the people that are still there, you are then failing almost like two ends. Now, the interesting thing about those people that I said, the Jews, many of them went back to Europe. But there was actually a country in the Americas that took a lot of Jews. Does anybody know what country that was? This was before the war, not after.
Argentina.
That was after the war. It was Dominican Republic. Does anybody know why? Why did they take all those Jews? their president was making the country more white. Yeah. He took on the Jews because not because he felt bad and he didn't want them to be prosecuted, is because he wanted white people to come to Dominican Republic and continue making DR whiter, to make them so separate and different than Haiti, because obviously they share the island. And you know, it is Argentina and a lot of Central South American countries that took a lot of Germans, if you want to say, after the war. And that's a very interesting subject in itself. And there were even Nazis who came to United States after World War II. But that's a different topic. But again, as the question was asked regarding responsibility, obviously, if you take people in, you should be responsible to get them on the best path possible. But it is often not the case in this culture.
Santi.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
I have two questions for you. The first one is, do you think your status as a refugee affected your political opinions or beliefs?
I would say yes and no. One thing that certainly helped is that we were well educated. So I think that was the biggest impact that it has had. My parents were well educated. We were from a mixed marriage. And I think my parents had always been much more open and were equal, I would say, more progressive than a lot of people even in Bosnia. So I would say my political beliefs have certainly been impacted, maybe not culturally, but much more about my particular family. Because what's interesting now is that there are many Bosnians in United States who are Republicans, and they like Trump a lot, which you would say, like, that makes no sense. How would a refugee support Trump? But I challenge you in this. If you study the Hispanic or Latino culture in United States, there's one particular group that is very much so in favor of Trump, and they are Hispanic. Do you guys know what that group is?
The Cubans, because they don't like communism.
Exactly. So Cubans, even though they are supposed to be Hispanic and Latino, and if you ask a white American, Cubans are not white Americans, they're still Hispanic, Latino. They don't identify as many of, I would say, as many of my students would. So most of my students have come from countries forcefully. They have come from a lot of poverty. They lean towards the Democratic Party. They supported Obama or are very outraged by what Trump is doing. But it's often the money and educational levels that lean towards that. So even if you come to United States, many Latinos or Hispanics who are rich favor Trump and favor his policies, even though that means favoring a government that discriminates openly against people who are of Hispanic background. And it's very, that to me is quite fascinating. But it does speak volumes that, again, what I said, just because you might be from a similar background or from a region of a country or a continent, it doesn't bind you. So just because, let's say you're Cuban and the president says that all Mexicans are basically rapists, that you should be offended because you are of Hispanic background. Many people don't see that like connection. So I would say what really separates, it's not so much even the statuses, but it's just basically your personal preferences. Because again, many refugees or immigrants in the United States are Republicans.
And my second question was, you talked about white privilege at the beginning, but then with the example you gave us of the Jews, I understood that meant that there wasn't actually a white privilege because Jews are white. And if there was a white privilege, then they will get a privilege and would get to come in the.
They're the wrong religion.
So you think there's not only does race affect, but maybe culture and religion, and there's other factors.
It's religion, because think about why Jews are always prosecuted, right? Jews killed Christ. They, are the ones that gave him up to Romans. So in Europe, where everyone is white, Jews were always prosecuted. In Russia, in Italy, everywhere, they lived in ghettos because they are not favored, or they're not even really considered to be part of those countries. And even though Jews, again, were coming in and they looked maybe white and would have been embraced, they still were discriminated because of their religious differences. So to really be able to enjoy white privilege, religion does play a part in it, because in United States culture, there hasn't, even though most of the presidents have been white, besides Barack Obama, all of them have been of a Christian faith. So we have not had any presidents that have been Muslim or have been Jewish. There's never been a Jewish president of United States. So you're right, it has multiple parts to it. The white privilege, it's not just about being of the white race. It's also like what white race you are. So for example, in American immigration history, they rank themselves. So Germanic and Anglo-Saxon, like the British immigrants, were the ones that started United States. Now, you probably know that some of the first colonies in United States were actually Spanish colonies. The ones in Florida were set up in the 1500s, while the ones in the north were by the Germans and the British were set up in 1600s. That's not acknowledged at all in this history, because the Spanish were considered to be less than the British and Germans. Why? Because the Spanish were closer to Africa, which often meant that they had darker hair and had darker complexions than some of the more northern Europeans. So even in Europe, there are rankings of who's better, like Italian immigrants. You know how we I don't know in Colombia, but in America, when you think of Italian immigrants, you think of like that show Sopranos, right? Hey, dark hair, dark eyes. Those immigrants are solely from south of Italy. So almost all the immigrants that have come to United States from Italy have come from the south of it. And the reason they've come is that the North Italians don't look anything like I or you would. They're blonde, blue-eyed, and tall. And they're much more Germanic because they're close to Austria than they are African, like the South Italians are. And the Jews, the Italians were looked down upon. Even in United States, when they came here in the late 1800s or early 1900s, they were considered to be like the bottom. So were the Irish. So even within the white privilege, there are rankings themselves. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and they got white privilege in DR, it sounds like. So the next question, the student would feel more comfortable if I ask it, but they were curious if your family still has some traditions, like your Bosnians do, some traditions from your original culture, like religion, and do you still speak your original language when you're with your family?
We speak Bosnian. I have a 5-year-old who refuses to speak Bosnian. We actually had a fight today in the car because I was saying something in Bosnian and she said, "Stop speaking that strange language, speak in English." And I know, right? And she has grown up around, my husband is Bosnian. My parents are Bosnian. My husband, like his mom is Bosnian. So we speak Bosnian, but it's interesting because at 5 years old, she can make a distinction of what is the general norm and what isn't. So she'll say, speak English, don't speak Bosnian, because she knows that to blend in, you have to speak English. When she was 3 years old, because she was staying with her grandparents, she only spoke Bosnian. She didn't speak English. So she would go to playgrounds and she would try to play with kids, but they only spoke English, so she wasn't making friends. So at 3 years old, she just stopped. She stopped speaking Bosnian completely because her little mind realized that that was not a favorable language. If she wanted to be friends, if she wanted to play with other children, she had to speak English. So it's really interesting to watch a child that young almost make these distinctions without being told. We weren't like, speak English only, we speak Bosnian. We encourage her to speak Bosnian. But it's very interesting, and I see it with my students as well. You know, for some of them, speaking Spanish is a pride thing. They like it. For others, it's not good. They don't like it. They don't want people to know that they're Spanish speaking. And so it's just like an interesting thing. Now, culture-wise, you know, we still cook simple foods that are Bosnian, maybe celebrate some Bosnian customs. But the hard thing is that the Bosnian population that exists in Boston has been very different from where I am. So I would imagine, let's say you and your family end up moving from Cuba to United States. Now I want you to think of like your mindset, the way you live, and then imagine that almost all other Cubans that are around you in the United States come from a completely different region with different cultures and different customs. You might all be Cuban, but you're very different. And in Boston, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of people who come from Sarajevo, or people that are from mixed marriages. So even within the United States, the Bosnians have kind of split themselves up. So there's a strong Serbian community here. There's a strong Muslim Bosnian community here. And we don't fit anywhere because we're not Serbian, and we're not Muslim. My parents were atheists, as I am. So and most of the communist countries, you know, were atheists. People didn't believe in God. So we kind of fell into this like very like middle, where even when people are Bosnian, I do have Bosnian friends, it's really hard to connect. Just because we have a similar background, it doesn't mean that we share similar views. Like, you know, a lot of my acquaintances who are refugees, as I mentioned, are Trump supporters. That to me is incredibly infuriating, because I have students who, you know, as I said, 40% of my students are Hispanic or Latino. So when we have a president who clearly says that Hispanic and Latino people are rapists and drug dealers and should be caged, and he sees no distinction between any of these people, you are just not English speaking, white, European descent. And he won't say it like that, probably because he doesn't know those words, but he just categorizes people. And it's really hard. It would be really hard for me to stand in front of students whose lives I've gotten to know, who I'm trying to teach, and support a view that the current administration is kind of spewing out. So we have had, I would say, some of our cultures. There are many culture gatherings around here that are Bosnian. I don't go to a lot of them, because I don't really feel like I connect to the Bosnians that are here. I am much more likely to actually go to Bosnia to go see my friends, because I feel like with them I can connect better. I hope that makes sense.
You were talking about religion, or sorry, about language. There's just a quick follow-up question. If the Bosnian language is, how different is it from Croatian or Serbian? Like a lot of times when we were watching Once Brothers 2, my students were curious, like what language those two men were speaking with each other, if they were just speaking their own and you could understand it well.
So before the war, the official language of Yugoslavia was Serbo-Croatian. That's what it was called. After the war, everyone kind of split up. So the Croats in Croatia, they speak Croatian. In Bosnia, they speak Bosnian. Serbia, they speak Serbian. They're all very much so the same, but they're also different. So
Would
for
you say like Spanish Portuguese level, or closer? Or
so like Spanish in Spain and Spanish in Colombia.
Okay.
Has anyone been to Spain?
I think probably
Is
all
it
of them.
different language-wise?
You guys can we're a smaller group now. You guys can turn your mics on if you want now. And if you have any questions.
I have a lot of students who are Dominican. and they have families in Spain, and they say when they leave DR and they go to Spain, the Spanish is very different. So maybe I don't speak Spanish. So maybe in Colombia, the Spanish is similar to what is spoken. But even if I've been to Spain before and I didn't speak the language, but you know, even in Spain, often people view the Central South American or Caribbean Spanish as being broken. That's the same thing in England. If you go to England and you come and they're like, oh, those Americans, they butchered the language. So it's like that. So Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian, I would say would be like English in England, in United States, and in Austria. In Australia. It's the same language. You can understand most of it, but it's different with different dialects or little quirkies in like the
phrasings.
Yeah.
And then again, if you guys have, Andrea, sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for sharing your story. I really enjoyed it. My question is, do you think you would be a different person if the war hadn't happened? So, like, in other words, do you think that the war changed you in a certain way?
Yeah. I mean, I would say certainly you can never go through a war and feel like you're not changed. I was having a conversation yesterday, as I was talking to my friends, and they were saying how they're in quarantine, and they said, well, we went through war and, you know, we stayed sane. And I laughed because I was like, no, we didn't. Like, you can't go through a trauma on that level and feel like everything's fine. And, you know, I feel like one thing is going to be this for you guys, to see like how long this quarantine goes on and what are the impacts of it. So I certainly have changed. I have PTSD. I have post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, I have certain triggers, like I don't like hearing loud noises. I don't like watching violence of any kind in a movie, or seeing any sort of suffering has always been a trigger for me. But I also feel like I moved to a country that had different views, and I'm glad that I did, because even though United States is not sometimes the ideal country that is portrayed on TV, it certainly has some wonderful, wonderful features. And you can always seek out the people that will challenge you. And that has been the best thing about living in the United States. It is so culturally diverse that you are always challenged in your beliefs. And when you are challenged in your beliefs, it's only then do you truly know who you are. Because all of us are like with our families, our mom, dads, and then it's the culture, you know, in our city or maybe our schools. And often we stay in that. Maybe we live, you know, in the same city and we are friends with the same people we went to school with. And you truly don't know who you are as a person until you separate yourself from all of that. Only then are you challenged to really think, do I feel this, or has my culture made me think that this is true? And that has been the best part for me as a person, being continuously challenged, not only culturally, but just, you know, by not only being a refugee or an immigrant, but as a person, the population, your teacher knows this, we work with a very diverse group of students who have made my eyes open very much so to what United States was from different perspectives. I cannot certainly not say I understand what it's like to, let's say, be Black and be an American, but through my students, I've heard many of stories that has certainly made my eyes open or challenged some of the beliefs I had. When we moved to United States, I thought Franklin was like, that's United States. Everything's great. Slavery ended. Everything's perfect. There were no Black people to challenge my views. It was until I moved to Boston and I went to university that I met such a diverse group of people. And I always tell everyone, if you have a chance to leave where you are and go live somewhere that's completely different, do it. Because it is only then where you truly understand what you believe, what you don't believe, what is cultural, what is just taught. Being in Sarajevo also made me ignorant to some of the things that were happening in more rural parts of Bosnia. Some things that certainly we never saw because, again, we were middle class. We weren't rich, but we lived a very comfortable life. So I would say certainly like my opinions would have stayed had the war not happened. We would have lived in Yugoslavia. My life would have been very comfortable. I would have continued kind of believing in maybe, that blissful ignorance where you are unaware of things and everything's great until you are aware of things. And then you're like, ooh, I didn't realize things were like this. So I would say it's a little bit of both, but I'm glad that I've had time, and I still do. I feel like one of the best things about being a person and being aware is that you're constantly changing, evolving, challenging, and hopefully bettering yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we took up like an hour and a half. Or does anyone have any lingering questions before I let Jasenka go back to her life?
My life of quarantining.
Yeah.
Go wash my hands 20 times.
I'm sure Mia needs you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jasenka, so much. All of you, thank you for sticking around. I'm going to upload this to Schoology, and I'm also going to email you. I got a lot of people, Jasenka, before they left, saying thank you to you. So I'm going to, is it okay if I give everyone your email address?
Yeah, you guys are more than welcome to have my email.
Just if they want me. Thank you.
Before all this started, all this craziness, I've always thought it would be so interesting to be able to connect students. To instead of talking to me about what it might be like in United States, how cool it would be for you to talk to someone your own age who lived in United States. But, this happened. But that's always been one of the goals and one of the things that I always wanted to do, just kind of connect people cross-culturally to learn and talk to each other and just understand. Again, like shattering those maybe ignorances or being challenged or enlightened by experiences. So feel free to reach out. And thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you
very much.
much.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.